Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2you.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so I'm delighted to welcome my guest for this episode, Chloe Wakeham. Chloe, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Where are you coming in from, Chloe?
I'm coming in from Cardiff, currently working from home.
Excellent, excellent. Rainy there as it is here?
No, it's actually sunny now, which is great.
Oh, it's not fair. It's raining here in Brighton. I'm jealous. Chloe, I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who they are, what they do.
So my name is Chloe and I'm a second year PhD candidate at Swansea University. And I study online mental health communities and kind of the historical emergence of mental health discourse and the use of illness identities on social media, in particular on Twitter and Tumblr.
Going by your topic, Chloe, you must be extremely busy. This has got to be one of the biggest kind of topics and features of modern day society, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think sometimes I'm in over my head about it, you know. I think sometimes I have to kind of like take a step back and see what's realistic, what I can actually do. And I've been challenged in the past about it where, you know, I've had other people's opinions or they've interjected and said like, how can you cover such a huge topic? And I mean, the answer to that is I can't, but I'm kind of, I guess, dipping my toe in like a couple of areas, I guess.
Do you want to tell us about those areas? Do you look at sort of specific kind of platforms, or is there a particular type of person that you look at in relation to this?
Yeah, so I wanted to choose two platforms. So I chose Twitter and Tumblr. I wish I could have chosen more, but realistically, with the time frame of a PhD, it wouldn't be likely that I would be able to do more than two. Yeah. So I chose two because I thought it was really important to have a really nice comparison. And Twitter and Tumblr are both very different platforms. They function very differently. And I just thought it would be a great way of kind of comparing the ways that people are talking and discussing mental health.
And I'm interested in particular there, you said they're very different platforms. They attract a different demographic. Is that fair to say?
Yes, definitely. And I think also because they both have different functionalities, you know, we communicate very differently using them. Twitter is, you know, it attracts academics or like people within that have their own businesses. I think it's fair to say it's like the elitist kind of type of social media that we have. Yeah. Whereas Tumblr is like seedier and darker in terms of its humor, and it's the kind of place that like you go online at night, whereas on Twitter you tend to like go on Twitter and post during the day.
That's interesting. I have to confess I don't know a huge amount about Tumblr. I use Twitter, and I know when I try and advise my students to use it, very few of them are on it, so it obviously doesn't attract a younger demographic. Who are the main users of kind of Tumblr?
You know, it's actually quite difficult to tell because I grew up with Tumblr, which is why it's an important platform for me to explore. So I kind of got introduced to it when I was 13. So in my early teens is when Tumblr kind of became a huge deal. And I kind of always thought it would strictly stay with teenagers. because it's quite an angsty platform.
Yeah.
But it's actually kind of grown up with my generation instead. And so even though it does attract younger teens, it's still kind of within, I don't know, like the late 90s kids.
This is possibly why I'm out of touch, Chloe. You're making me feel really old now. And then in terms of who you're actually looking at, your kind of sample group, do you focus more on men or women or older or younger users of social media?
No, it's kind of a free-for-all, actually. I'm not particularly interested in kind of age or gender or any of that. It's just more about how people are discussing mental health and how it differs. But I guess the only time that I do actually look at age and gender is when I interview people from these platforms or from these communities.
And when you say, people talking about mental health, are you talking about people talking about it in general, about mental health issues, or people who are personally explaining their own mental health issues?
It's both, but it's more about the language that's used.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the whole premise of my PhD, is that there are words that are not necessarily new, but they may have expanded in terms of their meaning. They may be continuing to expand and evolve, and what this means and how they're kind of discussed online. And so it's a combination of both. It's just people talking about it in general, but in every capacity, what they're talking about, how they're using the language, and so forth.
Thank you. So let's get stuck into a little bit more about your PhD then. So before we get into some of those terms, because that sounds really interesting, what's your kind of overriding hypothesis, if you like?
I'm not supposed to have one, really. I feel like my supervisor would tell me off.
Yeah.
It's difficult. I mean, I agree that, meanings of words are continuing to evolve, not just mental health terms. If you just look at any kind of words that we use, they're continuously taking on new meanings. I think that we should be erring on the side of caution with some of the stuff that's been discussed, because you just don't know how it's going to impact the way that we discuss mental health in the future.
What about your kind of methodology, if you like, then? How are you collecting your information? Is it purely kind of scanning and looking through different social media outlets through Twitter and Tumblr? Or is there a sort of further investigation, interviews, questionnaires and so on? How are you collecting your data?
Yeah, so I'm doing a ethnographic content analysis, which is like a combination of ethnography and ethnographic content analysis. So I get to look at these platforms, but I also get to kind of track and kind of trace the meanings of words. So the way that I've gone about collecting data is mostly through downloading tweets, about 1,000 tweets per week. Wow. And then I would take approximately 50 screenshots from Tumblr, and then I would just code the lot, which is very intense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult because it probably doesn't really make much sense, because you have to have a starting point as to what I'm actually downloading to begin with. So I kind of started with just the keyword of mental health. And from there, I would look at co-related and co-occurring hashtags that were related just to the word mental health. And I kind of started mapping out all of these hashtags and keywords for both platforms. And eventually I kind of started to see a pattern of what keywords were constantly coming up, until I was able to hone in on a few, maybe 5 or 6. And then I decided to focus on a single hashtag, which was trauma. But I think even though I've collected data on trauma, it's so much more than just that word. So
perhaps we could explore some of the other keywords in a moment, but as that was your starting point, trauma, do you want to tell us a little bit, what did your research find in terms of how the hashtag was being used?
Yeah, so I have seen trauma, and I think it's not it's not something new. Like, it's been discovered and discussed in the past in past research. I know that Haslam has like mentioned it in the past, and Frank Ferretti has talked about how trauma has kind of taken on this expansion of meaning. And I kept seeing trauma come up on both Twitter and Tumblr, and it was being used in various ways to sometimes describe something that was like a catastrophic event, and other times it was just used to describe an everyday life experience, which kind of drew me to it in the first place. So I then obviously had to kind of refer back to the literature. And, I think we often forget that the word trauma derives from the Greek word, which is to mean a physical wound. Oh. And whenever you kind of deep dive into this theme, it's harder to find research based on physical trauma. It's so much easier to find it based on psychological trauma. And that's because of the influence of people like Freud and Charcot and Janet, who really pushed and drove the idea of experiencing psychological trauma at the time. But I guess from collecting data and interviewing people, you can analyze memes and text and videos that use the word trauma in various ways. But when you actually get down to it and you compare that with interviews with people from these mental health communities, it's not just about trauma. It's so much more than that. There are other themes. I think it's difficult just to hone in on a single hashtag that's currently prevalent.
So was it being used as a kind of generic term for any sort of incident then? Is that what you were finding?
Yeah, and I guess it's difficult because obviously trauma has expanded in terms of its meaning. We think of trauma in terms of physical trauma, we think of it as psychological trauma, whether that's abuse. We think of kind of the diagnosis of PTSD and things like that, childhood trauma as well. Childhood trauma was actually a really prevalent theme that I kept coming across, that people would often make memes and jokes about it. And it just, I guess my curiosity was how they were going about to define it. And you have to be kind of careful because you don't want to challenge it, but you want to try and understand it, where it's coming from, where it's rooted in. But then on the other hand, people would use trauma as in to make, it's difficult. You can't tell if people are being serious or not. They might just be like, say something like, oh, I saw somebody wearing a handbag that was leopard print or something, and that traumatized me. And it would be something kind of silly.
Yes.
But you kind of have to question how it's being used and how it's expanding and how that can come across to other people, how the language is being used in today's society.
Yeah. So I wondered if people are kind of using it almost as a term of embarrassment. I had such a traumatic event, I tripped over and everyone saw me. Do you know what I mean? Sort of using it as an embarrassment as such.
I think for the most part, I think it's a form of expression. It's often humorous. It's often making a joke out of something. But I do actually believe that some people are actually being serious about their use of the word. And I do think there's a danger to that. And there's a danger to any kind of word that continues to expand and form, because it forms how we discuss mental health for the future.
Yeah. I wondered because I've noticed that myself as well in the last 10 years, someone might say, oh, absolutely traumatic experience or something was a nightmare. Or obviously the kind of recent thing is if someone's making a joke or they've heard a joke, people say, oh, I just died, which is quite a very odd expression, isn't it? But I'm wondering if we're pushing extreme experiences to try and exaggerate our feelings. This was such a trauma. This was a nightmare. I just died. There's quite a strange use of language, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like diagnostic language has leaked into everyday kind of discourse. It's even when, and we all do it. And unfortunately, we've all kind of just picked it up, and we don't really know why we say it. It sounds kind of extreme sometimes, but even things like, oh, I'm having a crisis when you're not having a crisis, or I hear people say, I'm having a panic attack, but they're not clearly panicking, and I don't know, it's not about kind of policing these words, but it's about kind of taking a step back and saying, like, how does this impact the way people are talking about mental health, and how is this going to affect our kind of future discourse? Like, where is it going to lead us to? And I guess what other words are going to continue to expand? And is it a good thing? Maybe it's not black and white. I don't think it is.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it kind of belittles those people that are truly experiencing those things. So if people consistently using the words, this was traumatic, this, panic attack, I'm having anxiety, this, and if they're not using it for the actual extremes, whether it belittles genuine cases.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that I've come across, especially when I've interviewed participants. I think they find it kind of insensitive, whether they've experienced it themselves personally or whether they have friends. Just using certain words can just come across as something that's insensitive, and I guess takes away kind of the purpose of using them, maybe.
Yes, I've had that with students. Not again, I don't want to put them down, but some students might be having a test of some sort, and they've described as having a breakdown, and so
Yeah.
You're finding it anxiety driven, and of course that must be taken seriously. But the use of something like "I'm having a breakdown," that's quite an extreme use, isn't it?
Yeah, I even think that just certain words or terms that we use that perhaps were never meant to be driven in a way to kind of express real struggle, but they've kind of taken on this whole new meaning, in the sense that it becomes kind of medicalized. Like it's very, like, it's medical terminology. And like, the one thing that actually really bothers me within academia is the term imposter syndrome.
Right.
Because as soon as I walked into my PhD, that was the first word that I heard. And I immediately was like, what? No, I don't want to have to relate to that.
Yes.
Because I feel like then it becomes part of everyday kind of conversation, and it's again sort of medicalized, and it doesn't make any sense to me, because I think, it's inevitable as a PhD student, or if you're, doing a master's or something, you're going to struggle, you're going to feel a certain way. It's not always going to feel light and happy and all of those things. And you're going to feel intimidated by other people because you're still learning, and it's an intimidating place. But I think just having a word to kind of sum it up is dangerous.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think any new position or situation you find yourself in, where there's a sense of, trepidation or anxiety or worry, then that's natural. I've thought that many people, when they first go into teaching, say it feels like imposter syndrome. And I think, well, yeah, because it's the first time you stood that side of the classroom. That's not imposter syndrome. That's natural kind of concern or worry about your ability. I think that's, I definitely agree with you on that one, Chloe.
I think it's this kind of obsession with wanting to normalize something, but it doesn't need to be normalized because it's already a normal thing.
Yes.
And I don't really like using the word normal and abnormal. It becomes a very hairy kind of subject to touch upon, but it's already a normal and natural thing to experience. So why label it? And I guess, like, I question that throughout my research all the time.
Yeah, because I don't know if this is kind of similar, but lots of students, sorry to keep referring it to students, but obviously because of my job, lots of students saying, during exam time, they're feeling levels of anxiety. And there's part of me that thinks, well, yeah, of course, you're doing your exam.
Yeah.
So you probably should be feeling anxiety. I mean, is that a little bit, am I taking that a little bit too literal there, or is there something in that?
No, I think that's exactly it. I think we all get anxious. It's natural, and it's natural for our bodies, and whether it's physically or emotionally or mentally or whatever, to respond in those situations. That's the whole point. And it kind of gives you a purpose, doesn't it? Because otherwise you would be like a robot.
Yes.
But it's just become so embedded in everyday discourse that I think people just naturally use those terms because they just don't know how else to express how they're feeling.
Yes, and especially if everyone else is using them as well. Like you said, it becomes part of the everyday lexicon, certainly. And can we pick up on some of the other words then, Chloe? So other than trauma, what were the other ones that you're noticing coming up a lot on both platforms?
I mean, anxiety was definitely one of them. Yeah. And so was therapy. There was a lot of, I guess, to categorize, there's a lot of focus on naming disorders like anxiety, depression, BPD. You see those kind of keywords coming into play all the time. And then you have things that are perhaps more promotative of mental health. So you'd have like mental health awareness or mental health matters. So you kind of have, on one side you have kind of like the diagnostic language, and then on the other side it's more of awareness raising, I guess, which I think, are all really important and relevant. But what I will say about kind of the more diagnostic uses of the hashtags is they have been studied countless times before. This isn't something niche. Even when kind of online forums kind of creeping online, and even Tumblr when it sort of started up, there was researchers like Giles and Newbold, and I think it was Moreno et al. In 2016. They kind of did work on like really serious kind of behaviors, like self-injurious behaviors, and like the pro-anorexia community. And this was all before kind of trigger warnings and content warnings came into play, and when before policies were implemented on these platforms. And they would look at hashtags like hashtag self-harm, and when trigger warnings came into play, you wouldn't be allowed to post under those hashtags anymore. So community members would devise their own, or they would add like 3 M's at the end, or they would use like a code word or something. So even though they very much still exist, I think I just wanted to hone in on something that was kind of being overused in today's language. Even another one that I looked at actually was trigger or triggered, because that's another kind of word that people use frequently. They'll say my fork touched wet food that was in the sink or something, or I touch wet food with my hand in the sink, I'm triggered.
Yes.
And it will be something like that. So triggered and trauma were definitely kind of more compelling themes that I wanted to explore.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure when triggered started to be used a lot. I can't remember it being used, 15, 20 years ago, but now it is, like you said, it's so ubiquitous. I'm not quite sure when it really slipped into the language.
I don't know, but it might be a product of trigger warnings becoming more of an acceptable thing on social media platforms. I mean, not even social media platforms, because obviously content warnings existed on movies. When you went to the cinema, like they would be there right in front of you on the screen. But they obviously moved into online spaces, but also into education.
Yeah, I wonder if I mean, this sounds like a really obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Chloe. And often when mental health is being discussed in the current times, there's this discussion about whether mental health issues have really genuinely increased to such large scales that we're seeing now, or is it just that people are talking about it more and we're more aware of it and we've got labels and words for them? Do you think mental health issues have actually genuinely increased, or it's just the recognition of it?
Yes and no. And the reason why I say that is because, yes, of course, there's a lot more awareness and like there's a lot more discussion. And I guess one of the questions that I always put out there is, aren't we talking about it enough? Haven't we raised enough awareness? And the reason why I kind of challenge that is because, I think we have to be really careful. And it goes back to what I was saying before, which is if you continue to kind of medicalize everyday experiences, more and more people are going to identify as being mentally ill. But you can't, I'm not saying that they're not. It's almost like a learned behavior by that point. But at the same time, I do think, it's really difficult to properly sort of encapsulate how many people are actually suffering, or whether it's just people having a chat about it all the time.
Yeah.
Because it's just a normalized thing that we do now.
Yeah, I was thinking something like, if someone were to say they had anxiety, that's almost impossible to measure, isn't it? Because everyone at some point during the course of their day probably does have some anxiety, unless you're on holiday and sat on the beach. If you're going to school, you're going to college, you're going to work, at some point during the day, you're probably going to have stress levels and anxiety levels going up. So how do you, if people are talking about anxiety issues as such, that must be almost impossible to measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes with pretty much every sort of diagnostic label that is out there. It's almost no longer a diagnostic label. It's just everyday language. And I don't think you can measure it because even those words like anxiety or depression have taken on new meanings. And because of their expansion, it kind of just allows people to relate to anything. If it's just a list of symptoms, you can pretty much relate to anything on that list. And so it's very easy for somebody to say then, oh, I must have anxiety. And it's not the individual's fault, but kind of with this continuous expansion, it's inevitable. It's an inevitable part of the process, I guess.
So is there an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy? Is that what you're saying?
I think there definitely is some of that. But I also think, it's kind of like the whole what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of concept, where it's like, is this a product of professionals intervening? We have so many therapies that are being offered. We're bombarded by wellness apps and like mindfulness discussions and well-being talks and well-being days and awareness weeks and influencers on our social media. Is it that influence, or is it, the DSM's expansion of their diagnostic terminology? Is it this sort of continuous use of medical language? Because I personally think we should be moving away from medical language. I think it's one thing to recognize people's distress and have open discussions and debate, but it's another thing to provide all these labels and allow multiple people to claim that they're ill. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, it feels almost like nobody can be well.
I'm interested. Firstly, if I could take a couple of those points, I'm interested with the cynical, slightly Marxist eye looking over this. I mean, mental health and the selling of self-help guides, books, apps, whatever it may be, that's big business, isn't it? Now, I literally am playing devil's advocate here, taking a cynical look at it. But if you convince the majority of the population that they have a mental health issue, you've got a captive market.
Absolutely. It is in some regards, it is literally down to marketing. and it works. It works so well, and it's actually pretty scary, because even when, you know, I'm offered something, I have to think about it and think, well, is this just marketing? Am I being told that I need to work and address these things in my life? But if we think of sort of, I guess, more of a philosophical kind of point of view, you have to kind of separate yourself in order to sort of enjoy your life. And I think we've kind of lost meaning. And I don't know if you're familiar with Chantal Dussault's book, Icarus Fallen, but it kind of just goes back to this idea that before the postmodern world, you know, we had religion and we had marriage, and now those foundations have been broken down, and we find community in other ways. And I think community is still very much a key part, but obviously in an online world or online sense, rather than going out to meet people, especially in today's world. But I think it might just have something more to do with the loss of meaning. But what that means, in a sense, is that it's almost impossible not to focus on the self and to focus on the individual and to stress and worry about everything that you're experiencing. So I guess marketing to those kinds of needs is a great opportunity for business.
Yes, and it kind of picks up on the other thing that I was going to ask you that you kind of mentioned as well, but there also seems to be this sale of how to be happy and how to be positive all the time. And forgive me, I can't remember who said it, but they said the problem with that is that humans are not supposed to be. You know, you do have days where you're upset and days when you're frustrated and day when you're anxious, and you have ups and downs. And if you sell the idea that you're supposed to be positive and happy 100% of the time, I mean, that is firstly selling a false dream, but secondly, you know, a big market again, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, happiness literature is a whole other kind of kettle of fish, I guess. But yeah, it's you can't promote the idea that you have to constantly strive for happiness, and because it's impossible, because happiness is not permanent, just like our other emotions. You know, you're not constantly sad, you're not constantly angry, so you're not going to be constantly happy. You can be content by all means, but happiness is not. It doesn't bear any permanence. But I think, you know, promoting ideas like that, whether it's through news media or social media or however it's promoted, it gives off this idea that it's inattainable. So people feel like they can never be happy.
And also that comes down to the problem of using something like social media, doesn't it? That people's lives are often a snapshot of their best moments. And if we view other people through that lens, we're seeing that other person saying they're always happy, they're always on holiday, the sun's always shining on them, if you like. And we get that problem of comparison there as well.
Yeah, and social media is a difficult one, I think, because it was kind of how my thesis sort of started out, because there were lots of these sort of claim makers saying, you know, social media is the cause of mental illness, or it's the cause of the rise of mental illness, and that's a huge thing to unpack. Because, you know, we have to acknowledge that what people put out on social media isn't necessarily true to life. And even though we might know that personally, it doesn't always give you the sense that, you know, you're not always going to let that go. Some people will focus on it. It's difficult, because how do you get away from it unless you want to delete all social media?
Yeah, it's true. I've talked about this a lot with my students because we study globalization and technology and so on. And some have made the brave decision to turn off all their social media. And bearing in mind, most of them are 16, 17, 18. I think that's such a brave decision to make. But all of them have described much better production levels and much higher levels of happiness as well.
I mean, I've definitely taken social media breaks, and I do them quite frequently throughout the year, because sometimes you just need to step away, and it's not even necessarily because of anything that I've seen. But every time I do it, I'm able to actually throw myself into things that are going on in my life, rather than just, oh, I'm taking a break, head down, looking at Instagram. It's not helpful.
No.
So I kind of treat it as, is this actually helpful for me? Do I really need to like stare at somebody who's, on holiday or posting 5 photos of their shoes? No, not really. It's not important.
No, I mean, that's one of the things that I frustrate myself. I put a documentary on, or I'll watch a film and then realize I'm not watching it. I'm looking at my phone.
Yeah.
It's a real frustration. I have to turn it off sometimes. But yeah, that is an interesting debate, whether social media is, I don't know, is it the root cause, or is it just a contributing factor, or is it just highlighting something that was already there?
I can't say for certain, truthfully. I wouldn't personally say that it is the root cause. I think it is highlighting something that's already there. But I do think in some ways it has to be a contributor, because of the way that people are discussing mental health. You only have to look at Instagram and its influx of influencers and promotion, and even ads. I get ads all the time for different well-being and mental health apps, and random stuff that you don't need or wouldn't help, like wear this bracelet and you won't feel anxious. And I look at it and I think, well, if only that was going to work, but it's kind of all very like Brave New World.
Yes.
And it kind of freaks me out, because I just think, well, I kind of want to experience my life though. And I think we should all be doing that, and it's almost like all of these other ways of trying to control something or avoid experiencing any kind of negative experiences it won't let you live your life. It's very controlling, and I don't want to be a part of that. And I wish more people would maybe reflect in that way, but it's difficult because they're being influenced.
Yeah. I think a lot of people do reflect on it, but they're still guilty of doing it. Do you know what I mean? I think many people have thought about turning it off, putting the phone away, spending less time on it, maybe even set themselves a target to have less screen time, and they can do it for a little bit, and then within a couple of weeks they're back to where they started. I mean, it's probably the biggest addiction of our time, isn't it?
Probably.
But our mobile phones, if you ask people to have a look at their average screen time, it's scary. It's pretty scary.
Absolutely. It's frustrating, because I would love to delete all my social media, but I can't currently for research purposes. But I would like to believe
that's your excuse, Chloe, for research purposes.
It's my excuse for now. But I would like to think that once I'm done, I'll be able to just delete it. It probably won't happen, but that's my ideal. I delete everything and go off and live in the woods in Canada or somewhere, and no one can bother me or know of my existence.
That sounds like an episode of Black Mirror. All internet, all technology goes down, and we have to go back to the real world. That would be an interesting experience, wouldn't it?
I mean, I'm kind of down for it though.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see how it pans out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually having to meet people and communicate without emojis.
Yeah. Me and my best friend a few years ago, we went on the Machu Picchu walk.
Oh yeah.
And we did the long walk, Salcantay trip it's called, which is sort of 7 days from camp all the way to the top, long way round. And there's no outlet for your phone there. There's no reception, there's no 3G, there's nothing at all. And on the first day, we kept on going to our pockets to look at the phone. Through force of habit. By day 2, less and less. By 3, 4, 5, you just kind of forget about it. By the time we'd got back to a point where we were allowed to turn our phones back on, we really didn't want to, because we knew we were just going to get absolutely bombarded, have to read all through the messages, and probably end up ignoring each other for a couple of hours whilst we caught up on it as well. But there was an absolute bliss in being completely disconnected. Actually, it's one of my favourite trips I've ever done.
Yeah, no, I think because it allows you to actually immerse yourself in what you're doing and experiencing.
Yeah.
And, it's like you can barely remember what life was like before technology,
Mm.
which is kind of scary. I mean, I was born in 95, so I kind of had the best of both worlds. Like, I didn't have a phone or a laptop, but I was being introduced to that kind of stuff. But I would still go outside and play with kids and meet kids and go to clubs and stuff. But I can't imagine what the younger generation, how they kind of just, you know, came out the womb and had an iPhone in their hands. Like, I can't imagine it.
No. No, but then I suppose if it's always been part of your life, it doesn't feel alien. You know, to spend 12 hours a day looking at a screen, that's not alien to it, to some generations, I guess.
No, it's true.
Slightly scary, eh? Chloe, thank you very much for your for telling us all about your PhD. So when are you aiming to get it all completed?
Hopefully I'll be able to submit my thesis by the end of next year, and then probably defend it the following year. So fingers crossed, as long as things go to plan.
Brilliant. And then you can come back on and tell us all about it when you're Dr. Chloe Wakeham, eh?
That would be lovely.
Thanks, Chloe. Could I just ask you to give out any details if people want to follow you on Twitter or find out more about you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at Chloe C, and then it's Wakeham, which is Wakeham.
That's great. And let's just hope that you're not having a social media hiatus at the time when people try and add you. But Chloe, I really, really appreciate you giving up your time today and telling us all about an issue which is so important, but also so relevant for our times.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.